Nicolai Petro is professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island and author of the book, The Tragedy of Ukraine. Nicolai Petro, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron.
As we're recording this, we have word of yet another new seismic development in the Ukraine proxy war. There is talk now that Ukraine's been presented with a new sort of ultimatum from Trump that these are the terms that we've hammered out with Russia. You have to accept them. It includes ceding all of the Donbass to Russia, even the part of the Donbass that Russia does not control. Also, a reduction in the size of the Ukrainian military. Now, we've gone through this before where you get reports about some new breakthrough, some new shift from Trump, which then, of course, is immediately walked back. So we have to take all of this with a grain of salt. But I guess from your vantage point, from what you can assess, what is your understanding of where things are at, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table?
So I think the battlefield situation is getting increasingly critical for Ukraine. There are some assessments that we're reaching a tipping point at which it is possible that the front line collapses at several points. The situation will be dire indeed. I'm not enough of a military analyst to be able to project what could happen. But I did see one assessment today that there are 7 key cities along the front line that are or could be on the verge of encirclement. And then after that, of course, the major fortifications in, not just Donbass, but also the regions to the south in Zaporozhye and Kherson. It would be up to the Russian forces to decide how far and how fast to go after the major fortification lines have been breached. And perhaps, just to speculate, perhaps it is to prevent putting Ukraine and its European backers in that kind of dire situation that the current proposal has been floated.
For people who will respond to this reported proposal from Trump that Ukraine cede all of the Donbass, and again, these are just reports. We've gotten so many contradictory statements. And it seems like inside the White House, there's just not a coherent position. You have different factions. Some people favor a peace agreement with Russia along these lines. Some people don't. But for people who will say that, no, this is how can Ukraine give up territory in the Donbass, especially the territory that Russia doesn't even control? Why is the Donbass so significant for Russia? And what would the argument be for Ukraine giving up all the Donbass, even the part that it still occupies? That it still has?
Because ceding the rest of it is inevitable. That would be the argument. In other words, knowing with clarity that the outcome is defeat and secession, ceding of that territory, I should say, then it makes sense to pull back and save lives in order precisely to defend that part of Ukraine, which Russia apparently, or at least ostensibly to this point, has not declared any interest in. The declared objectives are from Russia's side, the liberation of the 4 regions, and of course recognition of as well Russian sovereignty over Crimea. So 4 regions plus Crimea. Russia has no stated objectives territorially beyond that. So I guess the argument to cede the territory currently being fought over is precisely to reach a peace agreement sooner, and not just a ceasefire, but an actual peace agreement, which would be something that would allow ultimately for the rebuilding and investment into the rebuilding of Ukraine. Without with a mere ceasefire instead of a peace agreement, no one's going to invest in Ukraine. And the situation there, politically as well as economically, will only get, and demographically, will only get worse after peace, after a ceasefire.
I want to get your response to a few statements from Kaja Kallas. She is the European Union's top diplomat. She recently said this about the importance of keeping the Ukraine war going.
Supporting Ukraine is a bargain compared to the cost of Russia's victory. Wars are lost by whoever runs out of money or soldiers first.
Okay, so according to Kallas, Ukraine's a bargain, and we have to keep this going because I think she's suggesting that Russia is going to run out of money and soldiers first, which is
ludicrous.
Yeah, ludicrous. Yes. Okay, but before I get your comment, let's go to one more comment from her on what's happening in these ongoing peace talks between the U.S. and Russia.
Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear. Also, we have to understand that in this war, there is one aggressor and one victim. So we haven't heard of any concessions on the Russian side. I mean, if Russia really wanted peace, it could have, agreed to unconditional ceasefire already.
So there we go. We haven't heard any concessions from Russia. That's her complaint. And, what we should be seeing rather than these talks over, a 28-point plan on a final settlement should be at least an unconditional ceasefire right now.
No, that's absolutely wrong and ahistorical. If you want peace, you do not aim for a ceasefire, because a ceasefire is not a peace. In other words, a ceasefire is a temporary cessation of hostilities, usually, historically, in preparation for a renewal of those hostilities at a later point when the party that is at a disadvantage militarily has recuperated. So you don't want that if you want peace. A ceasefire and a peace treaty should be seen as essentially mutually exclusive. If you want peace, you aim for peace rather than a ceasefire. If you don't want peace, then you say, well, we'll take the way out, which allows us to continue to arm and rebuild. During the Vietnam War, we negotiated with Vietnam, the United States and Vietnam negotiated not to achieve a ceasefire, but to achieve a peace. And ceasefires were perennially rejected, or they were temporary cessations, but all of which were understood to not be sufficient to actually end the war. The objective here, again, if we're talking about peace, means ending the war, and the ceasefire is not the way to do it.
So you have in the U.S. right now the split inside the White House. You have one faction headed by people like Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg, who have been supporters of the proxy war. Then you have people like J.D. Vance, who's been a skeptic. Keith Kellogg, by the way, who was Trump's envoy for Ukraine, he's just announced that he's stepping down in January, which I think even more than these ongoing leaks about talks, I think might be the most concrete signal we have about which direction Trump is going. If Keith Kellogg, a strong cheerleader for the proxy war strategy, for Biden's strategy, is now leaving. But talk to us about Europe. Why are so many European countries, including Germany, seemingly so set on keeping this war going? What is their objective here, and what do they think is going to happen? We heard Kallas talk about how wars are ended by with whoever runs out of money and soldiers first. Well, Ukraine's running out of soldiers, and Europe is running out of money.
There are no logical, coherent answers to that question. A lot of European analysts who live there and have studied these processes of internal EU politics for a number of years scratch their head and are in disbelief, essentially, to what they are seeing. I suspect there are two strong reasons. One is war is profitable. A lot of people and a lot of business interests, a lot of bankers and the politicians that they fund, there's a mutually beneficial relationship there between politics, economics, and industry benefit from war. War, or preparation for war, rather, not the war itself, but the act of preparing for war, really provides an enormous stimulus to the economy. You'd think it would be more advantageous to stimulate the economy in sort of in the private sector, or in some sort of industrial development, but that turns out to be much more politically difficult to sustain. Whereas if you have a war narrative and a clear enemy that you need to prepare against, somehow that becomes much easier to fund. And the net economic stimulus is achieved in both cases. So I think this is simply an easier way for Europe to achieve to get an economic stimulus package. But the second reason that I see is that specific members of the European political elite and also members of the media are inextricably tied to supporting the war narrative, to supporting Ukraine. They got into this situation by the belief that it would be impossible for a Ukraine supported by the United States and Western and Europe and by NATO to lose. It would simply be impossible. The economic disparity, the quality of the military weapons that would be provided to Ukraine, the fierceness of Ukrainian resistance, all of this would lead to the collapse of the Russian economy and to Putin's defeat, which would be a net gain for Europe. So having invested in that narrative, their own personal political capital, it's impossible for them to reverse course without appearing completely unprepared and losing any hope for continued political success. However, what is happening, it seems to me, is that the parties that they are leading are, as a result, losing all or much of their credibility in support. Some of that is still sustained by the kind of rhetoric that you hear by Kaja Kallas. But as soon as you played the clip, I think you and I, and probably, I hope most of our listeners, noted the complete contradiction between what was said in the first half of the sentence and the second half of the sentence. In other words, yes, it is true that wars are lost when countries that are engaged in them lose money, are out of money and out of personnel, out of military resources and people to fight. But that is clearly the case for Ukraine, not Russia. And Europe does not want to step in and provide those resources, which it could, but there is no appetite for that among the European public. The United States has stepped up to the plate, at least to that extent, and been the first to abandon the pretense, at least, so far, under Trump. But it appears that European political elites will continue to cling to the fantasy of a Ukrainian victory for as long as possible.
We know that Zelensky is facing a lot of pressure right now, including from members of his own party, over this corruption scandal, a kickback scheme with some of his close associates profiting off of Ukraine's energy production at a time when many Ukrainians are going without power and heat because of Russian attacks. But what about inside Russia? Is there any pressure, any significant pressure on Putin right now to end this war, which is approaching the Russian invasion phase of the war is approaching its 4th anniversary?
There does not appear to be much public opposition. There are critical resources. Many of them, however, are abroad. and are funded by Western sources. This makes them vulnerable to the accusation that they are in the enemy camp, so to speak, when the Russian government sort of has to respond or to these articles in outlets like Medusa in the Baltic states and other Russian sources funded by Europe and by European sources. So there doesn't appear to be much pushback. There is more visible pushback among the more militant segments of the Russian elite and military. In other words, having fought back, clawed back the territory that was lost to Ukraine in 22 and early 23, and being in sight now of a decisive, perhaps, victory over Ukraine, why not pursue a maximalist agenda that Putin so far has not committed to? Putin is, it seems, at least judging from what we're hearing in the United States and from these ostensible negotiations and peace proposals, is willing to consider a negotiated solution. But there are many in Russia who would argue that any negotiation with the current regime in Ukraine is effectively postponing a decisive conflict with Ukraine and its European allies, pushing it off into the future. So for that reason, they would like to conquer and force into submission even more of Ukraine than would be subject to a negotiated settlement currently.
Finally, as we wrap, Nicolai Petro, any comments on the corruption scandal that Zelensky is currently facing?
What has been uncovered so far is in the energy sector, but there is a widespread consensus that it is much greater and much vaster. For example, the two anti-corruption agencies that are revealing and in charge of the investigation have so far actually said that they are not releasing, as a matter of public interest, the tapes related to military corruption, because that would directly undermine the morale at the front. But everyone, including, I was just reading an interview today with the former state prosecutor of Ukraine, Igor Lutsenko, assumes that whereas the corruption scandal with the energy in the energy sector is 100 million, maybe a little more or less, we're talking about an order of magnitude greater corruption in the military sphere.
Well, again, all the more reason why your book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, is such an appropriate title. It is such a tragedy. It all could have been avoided. And I strongly encourage people to read your book, because I learned so many details on the internal dynamics of Ukraine, and again, how this alliance between Ukrainian ultranationalists who wouldn't accept the Minsk peace accords and a powerful bipartisan establishment in Washington has led to the tragedy that Ukraine continues to face today. So thank you, Nicolai Petro, for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you, Aaron.